for today, we're going to go sort of lo-fi. We do not have any sort of interactive Miro that's going to be going on. Really, all that we need is something for you to write on, and perhaps something that has a pretty strong contrast, because I think what I would like to have us do, especially towards the end at the FutureCast share out, is just utilize your webcam. Just hold some whatever paper you have or whatever notes or FutureCast pitch that you've created. Just hold that up and we can talk about it and you can share out there. Or optionally, if you'd like, I think some of our friends at Reclaim Futures are going to drop this link into the chat, but there is an opportunity for you to join, as I'm speaking in the beginning, for you to create an Arena account, and then you can join this public channel. And towards the end, I'll be releasing some resources and some of the examples from some of the theory that we'll be discussing today. So that's going to be a good resource, especially if you want to see something very specific as you're working on the FutureCast, especially at the end. So from a supplies checkpoint, super minimal, just something that you can write on, take some notes with, high contrast if possible, and then the chat window. Yeah, we'll just see how that goes. So the agenda today. This is going to be a pretty cool mix of theory and application. So if this were, let's say, an all-day workshop, we'd probably have way more time to sort of explore each of the zones that I'm going to introduce very soon more. But for the purpose of today and the fact that we're online, what I've done is created 2 checkpoints. So in the first section, I'm going to be speaking a lot in the beginning, and then the closer that we get towards the middle half and the end is when you will be presenting or sharing out a little bit more of where you're going. And every progressive checkpoint, the first one will be tired versus wired, and there you'll keep building on your idea as we go forward. So as we go, you don't have to worry about trying to figure everything out at the end. There's going to be a very progressive journey through this. So, but to start all of that, I'll definitely be talking about, why are we here? Why are we talking about something that has a cool name but has no meaning yet? So I'm going to help demystify that, walk us through this whole process. And at the end, we'll discover, or at least I'll just share out my version of the new frontier, and I would love to see how you apply some of the learnings throughout. So with that said, I think I'm just going to kick us off, and let's go on a small field trip, to 2019, pre-COVID. I'm sitting there somewhere in Mexico City last spring and consulting on a project that had something to do with nootropics. And I really found myself thinking like, okay, one, I had to do a lot of research, and I'm going to explain on the next slide what nootropics are, but also just to sort of really set the stage for you, I think what I began to tap into is that I was really on the edge of something new with no wayfinding for me to figure this thing out. So this became a bit of a labor of love, and I'm happy to share this and yeah, tell you what I've learned along the way. But for those of you who are like me, not knowing what nootropics are, and it's pronounced like nootropics even though it's spelled with a double O, it's essentially like a supplement or a substance that can help improve cognitive function, particularly like memory, creativity, motivation. And some of these you may have heard of before. Definitely the most common and familiar one, even though it hasn't typically been called a nootropic, is caffeine. And then some of the other ones that are a little bit below the surface: modafinil, ashwagandha, L-theanine, ginkgo biloba, C60, and we'll look at some examples in a minute. But one of the things that was very enticing to me and also struck a bit of curiosity is the fact that it wasn't until 2017 when someone just very casually asked me like, well, what's your stack? And I thought they meant, well, what's your tech stack? What are you using at work? And they're like, no, I'm talking about what are your, what's your enhancement pool? What are you using to, keep your mind flexible throughout the day. And so that was sort of my first touch point beyond the consulting, was learning about modafinil in that regard. So, but let's look at something a little bit more practical, like what's out in the world, how does this manifest itself, and so one of my favorite examples is Recess, because what they're doing is, they've bottled some CBD and adaptogens in a can, but the way that they promote and sell this feeling is extremely unique, and it's something that I haven't seen done with such a degree of detail and humor and levity. And I really think part of their brand message has been so fascinating to me, because what they've been doing is cleverly, bringing in ways to sort of metaphorically talk about how some of these feelings of levity and lightness can emerge just through a product. And so some other things in this space, what we really start to see, like with kin, especially around kin, they're selling this whole idea, kind of selling you the mystique. It's everything around the can. It's not so much actually, hey, here's this bottle of elixir. But in this case, these nootropics that Kin Euphorics are selling is meant to be an alternative to alcoholic beverages. So there's very interesting combinations happening in the nootropics world. And there's a lot of very interesting chemistry taking place. And some of these examples might be a little bit more US centric. I'd be very curious to see if anyone's heard of these around the globe. But, aesthetically as well, like, as some of these examples keep going, like moon juice, for instance, it could be technically difficult to sell a pill, especially with nootropics and adaptogens included, when typically that's not going to be something that's, front of mind or on the tip of everyone's tongue. So this aesthetic exercise for me, or just doing all this research last spring, I was really starting to see a pattern, or what I'm going to, really refer to more and more throughout this workshop and this presentation as a signal in the noise. And you're beginning to see some of these motifs take place. There's strong emphasis on, very bright, vivid, futuristic psychedelia, gradients, very bright light, and looking at some of these things coalesce and come together, I don't think is a mistake. And so definitely towards the end, when we get closer to the future cast, I'm going to pontificate a little bit more about how this is more than just a sort of a surface level visual treatment. I think something deeper is happening. And just for fun, like, this is the last example as well that I'll bring up, but it is interesting to see, capital B brands, like big, global brands that we're familiar with, like Starbucks, they're starting to dip their toe, I think, a little bit into this phenomenon as well. So we can see like what they've done here with the nitro cold brew. And apologies if the stream lag is sort of diminishing the video quality. There's not a whole lot of videos in here. This is probably one of the only ones. But one of the interesting things that I think they're beginning to try and tap into and explore is this idea around synesthesia, and really trying to elevate and sell the feeling without looking like the rest of their products. And I think they've probably taken a nod from some of the other brands or trends as they're happening. So to that point, again, you're going to hear a lot about this signal in the noise. So when there's a lot of work or marketing point of view out there that really starts to feel all the same, that's when I start to lump that into the noise. But this has really piqued my curiosity. And so I think really the whole workshop is basically just me unpacking all of the curiosity that I've been going through for the past year and a half now. But yeah, more importantly too, I wanted to go beyond the surface level trendscape and really unearth what's deeper, what's below the surface on all of this. And so over time, what we may notice is that, things that we're very familiar with now may not have the lasting power. And, like Recess was one of these, like a CBD water, 5 years from now, is that going to still be a a pervasive force or something that, you know, I'm going to reach into the fridge or go to my local bodega and, you know, find in the fridge. But yeah, so fads, you know, much shorter lifespan compared to something that, you know, we'd call the trend. You know, like in the past, let's say 6 to 7 years, we've really seen a lot of things like rental economy, gig economy. You know, that's definitely in the trend space. And then the level above that, you know, the forces at play here, these are things that probably you've experienced your whole lifetime, and maybe even depending on how old you are or how young you are, maybe your parents have experienced some of these larger forces at play too, especially around concerns like digital data privacy and climate crisis. And then the level beyond that, like, you know, sort of the universe brain, the final boss, if you will, are like these human truths. And so for me, nootropics, and especially the aesthetic production and some of the philosophy around how these things are being presented, marketed, sold, for me began to tap into these human truths. And in particular, some of these, it's either just like connection with the inner world, yourself, or a more relaxed response to the outer world. And so the signal in the noise here is that I think the signal, even though we could be looking at the actual object of something that might be a fad, you know, CBD water, or adaptogens, nootropics, I do think that there's a path to a deeper human truth. And so that's what we're going to explore a lot in the next, you know, 2 hours. So for me, you know, I'm totally, we're going to go in detail and at length at what Turbo Mañana is, but the point that was useful for me was to really turn this into a bit of a terraform. And if I can, you know, if you take maybe 1 or 2 things away from the workshop today, it's probably very important to realize that one of the things that I'm engaging here is this sort of this concept of mythopoetry. And another way to think about that is that how do you combine some of the aesthetics and the data, and how do those come together? And so if science explicates, if science explains the world around us, then poetry implies the inner, or it just sort of implies some of the truths. And so the thing that I found interesting and that we'll, you know, explore as we go forward is, you know, maybe it's in your own life or with clients that you deal with, or just people that you may consult with in the future, but using poetic visions, mythopoetry, something that's not a standard rubric model or your everyday like quant and qual sort of research surveys. It's something interesting that we can at least explore or think about, and something that I've been trying out a lot recently. And yeah, that's exactly what we're going to be doing today. So I was thinking about the nootropics and where they sit in our current reality. You know, a very useful tool or engagement model that sometimes I go to is just a very simple 2x2. I try and map things, I try and figure something out, deconstruct it, understand the intent, the sort of the motivation behind it. And so when I was lumping, or, you know, attempting to, and I think that's what this is getting at, is that the terraform came out of this 2x2 exercise. Because for me, you know, when you look at something that's like wired and established, you know, this is very trendy and current, but the whole millennial minimalism and the blanding exercise, some of the nootropic elements that I've come across, especially in research, I mean, it's close, but it's not exact. And is this tired and established? Is this, you know, the very current late stage capitalist sort of money grab? And yeah, it's not, you know, it's not lost on me that these products are making money, but it's also not a clear reaction to something that's a little bit more sinister. And we'll definitely expand on some of this late stage motivation in the following section. So if those are the current realities, and then we start looking at possible futures, this wired and experimental quadrant is definitely kind of where I felt, if I had to label this or give something a name, this is sort of these three question marks here, definitely the area where I was thinking like, all right, is there a name for what I'm trying to lump the nootropics into? And the answer was, for me, was no. So it became, yeah, just a really cool way for me to sort of deconstruct and move forward. And then you can see tired and experimental, Silicon Valley of doubt. You know, it's when I put that in, or when I started thinking in that nature, I started realizing that there's this cool blend between aesthetics sometimes and socioeconomics. And this just sort of morphed into this, this labor of love that I was speaking about before. And so we're going to look at how I turned the 2x2 into this terraform, or this new map. And so I deconstructed and I started placing the quadrants and turned them into axes. So you can see here that, and this will all be zoomed in every section forward. So if you can't read this, I'll definitely, you know, we'll get to the point where this is more visible. But, you know, what I started doing was deconstructing some of the forces, the socioeconomic forces at play, and then trying to understand, like, well, how do aesthetics and cultural production work on these axes? And so McDonaldization as a service and the Capitalocene, you know, this is very much on this axis of capitalist realism. And then, you know, continuing to build out this terraform, I started looking at the inverse or the meta of some, you know, the opposing force. And then that began to really help set the stage for how this terraform can evolve. And so for the workshop today, like, this whole map exercise is worth like its own its own like little breakout session and conversation. So we can definitely have internet beers around this topic in particular later. And I know I'm flying through this, but we're going to go over every section in detail. And that's where these checkpoints come in. So it will not be me talking forever, I promise. But I just really want to set the stage and help show you this, you know, why I think that there's a signal in the noise and what this new frontier is. And we'll get into Turbo Mañana. But first, what we're going to do, in order to really help clarify and add the necessary perspective for Turbo Mañana, we're going to start examining these other quadrants and axes before we get there. So in detail, we'll go through McDonaldization as a service / Capitalocene. And then we'll look at the two possible paths out of the world of yesterday, either through Neo-Feudalism and the axis of accelerationism, or something that's probably more likely, and what I think a lot of us are currently experiencing, is sort of this upper arc here between McDonaldization as a service and Humanist Blandcore. And there's a path out towards Turbo, and so we'll discuss that. But just to kick us off, this first section, there's going to be a deep dive and a bit of a mimetic spectrum exercise. And if this was like an in-person or an all-day workshop, there's ways that we can explore this. But for the purpose of today and us being extremely online and at our homes, I'm going to use some of the mimetic spectrums as a bit more of a thought starter for you as we dive into the first checkpoint section of the workshop, which is the tired versus wired exercise. So without further ado, I want to introduce us to the world of yesterday. And so there's probably no better way to kick this off than with a quote from Mark Fisher. It's easier to imagine an end to the world than an end to capitalism. And so this full circle moment, which we'll hit on in Turbo Mañana at the end, is really sort of worthy of this intro. And so if you haven't heard of Mark Fisher, I totally, you know, and I'll send out a reading list later if you want that. But very interesting ideas and captivating, probably more so than interesting, and sometimes scary. So yeah, this first section is going to be a little like slightly doom and gloom, but we will transcend. So capitalist realism is the belief that there is no alternative to capitalism. And the McDonaldization as a service is something that it is very pervasive whether we realize it. It's not always very clear. It sometimes acts as a bit of a specter in the background. And this, McDaas uses efficiency, calculability, standardization, and social control to serve the Capitalocene. And in this case, like Capitalocene, we've all, most of us should be familiar with the Anthropocene, which really takes the point of view that humans are the root cause of the sort of the Earth, destruction of Earth. But I would propose, and this isn't proposed by me, this is, Capitalocene's out there in the world. It's just that I tend to agree with this take on it, is that it proposes that the Anthropocene is a little too focused on human species, and it sometimes misses or overlooks the systematic inequalities that shape human behavior. So there's a little bit of a cause and effect thing here that that's important to keep in mind. And so the world of yesterday, for me, this symbiosis of, excuse me, McDonaldization as a service and the Capitalocene, what I think this is really doing is that it's sort of enhancing the rift between humans and nature, and it's perpetuating a bit of an existential threat, not only to us, but also in some cases to creativity. So, yeah, there's an art project out there that I think really so we're gonna deep dive into this axis of capitalist realism. And when we start to think about, the things on either end of this spectrum, so we've got late stage, and then on the other side, we've got plutocratic corporatism. And there's an art project that I think does a really good job of, you can probably see it. The website is hqco2.org. I really appreciate the art project because what it does is sort of put some of these large multinationals a little bit on display, really critiquing some of the output and showing not a direct cause and effect, but more of a generalized reaction to some of the actions or behaviors taken by some of these larger companies. And so that really helps set off the point of view that we can start to look at and examine in the following mimetic spectrum. But the really important thing to take away from some of this corporatism idea is that a lot of some of the pain that the Earth is sort of experiencing right now, these greenhouse gas emissions, there's very few organizations and companies, when you think about the quantity that are causing and leading up to this climate trauma that we're currently living in. So yeah, you can see here, like Seth and Jeffrey, they created this art project, and super cool. So I would check that out. But sometimes we can laugh or we can cry, and I think sometimes memes just sort of like do a really excellent job of like getting the point across. And so if we start to map out and plot some pieces of cultural production, or just sort of memes, data that's currently out there, like I just have folders full of examples of things that really sort of allow me to pause and sometimes just think about like, really honestly, like a plastic bag being sold for $81. And this KFC thing gets me every time. Like, just sort of the unchecked market will just keep reproducing until Earth's supplies are exhausted. Like, that's kind of the whole takeaway for me for some of these capitalist realist endeavors. And then on the other end, so then when we start to look at like the corporatism aspect of it, these two are just so intertwined and interrelated that it's really fascinating when you start to look at the mimetic spectrum here. And in person, I think this exercise allows for a little bit more of like expression. But for the purpose of today, like, this will definitely be available later on Arena visually for you to look at. And that kind of leads us to this first example that I want to walk through. And so if we start to think about, well, how are ways that we can step away or, transpire and get out of the world of yesterday? And the first engagement exercise that I think has been useful for me has been, a very simple but sometimes super deep tool. So this tired versus wired exercise, I think, comes in handy. So definitely, if you've got paper and Sharpie at home, like, this is a really good time to start mapping this one out. And then I will keep setting this up as we go. But for the beginning, like, I kind of want to break down an example just so you really get the points that I'm trying to convey. And so if we start looking at behaviors that are destructive for Earth, and I'm going to pick on fast fashion here for a bit, and that definitely takes the tired versus established quadrant. In pursuit of profit, historically, this is including unfair labor practices, and just in the effort to act as a champion for quarterly earnings and shareholder value. And then when you look at the evolution of that, or at least a counterforce or a reaction, so when things start to get more experimental instead of established, I'm sure most of us are familiar with upcycling. And so even though this is still a behavior that's happening, hitting critical mass or critical acceptance is going to be really important. And so that's when it becomes vital to start looking at ways to elevate out of yesterday's thinking. And so certain companies are beginning to do that. And so when we start thinking about, like, circular economy areas, I think Nike is a bit of a signal in the noise at this point. So their new shoe, the Space Hippie, especially as a reaction to fast fashion, embracing the circular economy to eliminate waste and pollution from manufacturing. So what I love here is that, they've sort of renamed the process. They're trying to take control back slowly, because it probably takes a lot of effort and time to move a really big corporate behemoth into a new direction. So I love that they're calling it like space junk and crater foam. But at this point, some of the shoes that they're experimenting with in the circular economy model, it's almost a one-to-one, so they've used 60% repurposed materials from factory scrap in order to make the Space Hippie shoe. But then when we start to really expand and look at companies or behaviors, and again, just sticking in the fashion sort of world here for the tired versus wired, I am super enthused and very curious. And I mean, look at these names too of the shoes, like that. I love that, Space Hippie and Futurecraft.loop. So I would say very much like in a +1, Adidas has taken it to the next level. In 2021, they're going to launch a 100% recyclable shoe. So it's made to be remade, and it's fully composed of recyclable thermoplastics. And owners are invited to return their first pair for a one-to-one replacement. I'm not sure the chain after the first return, but to me, this is like a huge sort of a symbiotic improvement and adjustment between the consumer, a large multinational conglomerate, and the Earth. So I think a new sun rises for me when I start to think about the Futurecraft loop and what that means moving forward, especially if it gets mass acceptance. And so I'll definitely be in line to purchase a pair. And no, Adidas is not a client, do not work for them, never have. I just really like the intent and sort of the direction that this is going. So yeah, as an example, you can start to see how, tired versus wired, especially when you map out something that either you're curious about, angry about, passionate about, you can start to begin to find a path out and at least start pointing towards a direction that is not sort of in this plutocratic, late stage sort of dark mess. And so here we go. This is our first engagement tool and the first checkpoint. And what I definitely want us to do independently, and if you've got ideas, like I'm, as soon as I stop talking, which will be very soon, we can have a discussion, or if you want, you can work independently and, share your work via webcam. But really what I want you to do, the most important thing, is to find and identify a passion area. So if we look at the number one area here, so what's something that's tired and established, or just something that you are curious enough about to want to evolve and take it to the next level? So is there a subject? Is there a service? Is there a product? Is there something that you are curious about, interested in? And then quadrant number two, the evolution of this. So if we remember fast fashion, and then a possible exit from that was upcycling or sharing clothes with friends, etc. So have you witnessed an evolution from the subject, service, or product, or idea, religion? It can be anything. Like I would love to see where you guys take this. So what's the evolution of that? And then number three, wired versus established. Is there anything right now that's a bit of a signal in the noise? Have you witnessed something in this area that might evolve or move into a positive revolution or an evolution? How is it new? And in what way does it captivate you? How does it begin to sort of draw you in? Very much like the very creative naming of the space hippie, crater foam, like space junk. I'm a bit of a sucker for those elements and things, but it's also the intent behind it. So if you can think of a signal, what's wired about the current passion area that maybe is due for a bit of a refresh? And then finally, in the fourth quadrant, what is the possible future for this passion area, and what dismisses the world of yesterday? So here is the pure creation quadrant. What I want you to do with this identified passion area is invent a possible future, or identify something that already exists and embraces the hope for a different tomorrow. And I can go back to the example if you'd like, but what I will do is just, I'm gonna stop talking and I'm gonna play a little music, and this track is about 7 minutes. So if you're not into the track, feel free to turn on the music, and then I'm going to divert my attention to the chat and see what's going on over there. So 7 minutes, start mapping this out. yeah, so don't be scared or timid. Like, if you've got a question or you want to see anything, I see that there's some activity on Discord, so I'll definitely make sure that I get some links sent out there. And yeah, if there's at any point, if you guys want to share something in progress, like this next checkpoint is really an area for you to take a breather, for me to stop talking at you, and yeah, dive in. Okay, so I think that track was about 7 minutes, but what I want to reiterate here is that even though I can't see the progress or the vibe, you don't have to be finished, because the checkpoints that we'll have moving forward are progressive. So the next engagement tool, the whole purpose is just to keep building on this passion area that you have identified, hopefully at this point, and started to look at the evolution, the signal and the noise, and thinking about ways to create a possible future, or at least just exit from some of the systems that are unfortunately capturing the world of yesterday. So what I'll do for the purpose of time is that I'm definitely going to move on beyond the screen, and then just remind everyone that on the Arena channel, like when we get to the final future casting section of the workshop, I will unlock and reveal all of the examples that I'm showing you, and then all the other important stuff that we'll get to towards the bulk in the end. But so like I said, like this is it's a bit of a journey that I'm taking you on through this new terraform. And so when we start to leave and exit the world of yesterday, there's ways that we can exploit and there's ways that we can explore. And I think there's no two better ways to sort of map out that exploration than some of these paths that have been explored in the terraform that I shared earlier. So here in this section, we're going to be looking at Neo-Feudalism, taking a deep dive into the world's fastest Black Mirror episode ever. And that'll make more sense when we get there. And then also Humanist Blandcore. This is this is probably the more likely path out, but definitely we'll explore like what does that mean, and yeah, why are we here? Like what got us to this point? So anyway, the journey continues, and then so at the end of this section, we'll have another checkpoint like we just experienced, and so we'll just keep building on the passion area. So just to remind you, we are going to study and examine the axis of post-Fordism and the axis of accelerationism. And we'll start with Neo-Feudalism, and just the sort of the key takeaway here, the highlight, the TL, too long didn't read. Accelerationism is really the idea that capitalism, just has to, what happens when we press the gas pedal all the way to the floor? Like it just has to be overcome, and it has to be sort of exhausted within itself in order to generate any sort of radical change or movement, an idea that can exist beyond it. So it's a key topic here. And the thing that we'll explore on the spectrum too is that we move from the corporatism angle over to acid communism, there's some really deep, like super fun philosophical concepts that we can explore. And I would love to, especially if this isn't the perfect forum on a whereby or a live stream Twitch to talk about that, like definitely like let's have conversations about that as we keep going. But hyper-accelerationism will result in a retro-resurgence of practicing fealty, most likely before we witness post-capital. And I think the thing to take away is that, in my mind, the way I see this thing playing out, if it's accelerated the way I think it's going to, is that it's going to be a bit of a medieval rebirth. And in our current state, I think it's really going to assume that humans are either running algorithms or are going to be run by an algorithm. And that gets a little daunting and scary. And we're going to deep dive into an example about what I mean by that. So the other thing too that's interesting to note, for me at least, is that like the aesthetics and human behavior under this system continue to be a bit stigmatized by the megacorps and the technocrats of the world. And that's why sort of the inverse of this, on the other side of the terraform, you've got Humanist Blandcore, and there's a lot of connections and synergy between some of these stigmatization efforts and why we're all kind of seeing the same thing over and over again, and why everything's just being reduced to this lowest common denominator. And so if we look at this spectrum, so we've got, swamp of the tired, and then on the other side, we've got this sea of the experimental, and it gets super experimental as we start getting a little bit closer to acid communism. And what we can explore here, is at least in the vein of like these large megacorps taking over, I definitely want to take time for us to think about, or at least just for me to talk about some of the implications of Facebook Libra. Because typically, like, a defining feature for a country or any sort of sovereign state has been for them to make their own money and have their own minting and circulation of very state-specific currency. And so when you've got corporations like Facebook that are now taking over this prerogative from governments and introducing Libra, you've got some of these behaviors that could be a bit of a darker signal in the noise that could lead to corporate nation states. And that's probably not something that I think most of us want, or at least not in the hands of organizations that maybe we don't fully agree with. So this is taken from an article, the rise of corporate nations. And again, like, I will make sure after this that I assemble all the necessary links and share those out either via Arena or Discord. So keep an eye out for those. But if we start to examine the spectrum again, so it just seems like, if you remember back to that quote, a lot of the patterns and destruction are sort of coming from, at least from that time frame that quote talked about, from about 90 companies or so. if that gets accelerated, if that company becomes, or if that number of entities becomes smaller and they're just huger, what is that going to spell out? What's that really going to mean? And so I think at that point, if we keep going, or if there's a path where we accelerate and we keep going faster the way that we've been going, where some of these companies just get huger and huger and huger, it's going to take a real revolt. And so that's why it's important to think about, on the other end of the spectrum, one can't live without the other. So when you start thinking about the revolts and people sort of trying to take back freedoms and also their time, because I think acid communism starts to really dig into how potentially some of the neoliberal values start to really train people of ways to not be so critical about the time that's required for them to produce labor in exchange for money. So anyway, super deep topics. You can see here on the spectrum, I've definitely made it a point to call out, Libra, like we just spoke about. Keep an eye on that. And then, the whole big data concern, that's just going to get a little bit more freakish potentially. And then, yeah, so of the proponents and contributors to the idea of acid communism, definitely keep an eye out for Jeremy Gilbert's, Michel Foucault, and of course Mark Fisher. And there's going to be a little bit, more of this acid communism stuff sprinkled in towards the end. So definitely we're not done talking about it, but just sort of keep in mind that if things keep doubling down and the pressure keeps happening on the plutocratic side, the accelerationist revolt is probably going to be very close to some of the very joking and light, especially the fight for the 4/20/69 work week. I saw that meme and I was like, oh, that's perfect. It's perfect for this. Yeah. So this is that Black Mirror episode that I was talking about. So I'm going to walk us through a scenario of what happens when a certain, mega corporation, which will be very clear who I'm talking about, what happens if they're just left unchecked. And again, this scenario, this Black Mirror episode is a little bit more US centric, but I think you get the idea. So let's just imagine 4 years from now, the year is 2024, and the United States government has recently accepted Amazon's capital annexation of the Pacific Northwest. Capital annexation. So Diego and his family are climate refugees from Miami, Florida, and recently moved to Prime Tana. And what we can see here is in this sort of future dark, that's the other thing too, dystopias are a bit too easy. And so sometimes, I don't want to dwell here too long, but a lot of the cultural artifacts that we see, especially in cinema, not all the time, but mostly, that's why it's so easy to go dystopic. It's just because it goes straight to the root of our fear. But, in sort of this neo-feudal world, you definitely see something I'm hinting here at the introduction of Amazon's own currency, and what happens even if they don't geographically own the territory, but if they have a capital stake, or maybe they create some sort of tax haven, certain states just become zoned differently, Prime Tana here. So if we look at Diego, having to move for work because of climate change and seeking security, you can see how things start to get a little scary when there's the option here for them just to sort of essentially going to the company store. There's that old saying of basically, not only does Amazon become the supplier for capital, but also the landlord. So there's just sort of this weird, freakish, feudal, medieval thing that could come back. And as I've alluded to on this other screen too, you can start to see how things like Prime Health Score and diet and sort of permissions come in, and that could be a little bit freaky. But as an Amazon employee citizen, Diego is encouraged to stay productive and healthy. So here you can start to see well, what happens when the plutocracies really just press on the accelerator. And it's hey, based on your last Amazon doctor check or health score, you should probably have heart healthy meals. And so You know, they're recommending diets, they're pushing foods that you can eat, all under the veneer of like less creepy freedom. And then, yeah, just to like really dial in on the Black Mirror stuff, like you can see that, you know, they could have a Prime Health echo therapist for smart home mood stabilization and everything. So this is easy, you know, this stuff is, I think the real challenge is trying to find the protopian, or, you know, the less scary paths out from this. But anyway, that was the world's shortest Black Mirror episode. But I think what I'm really trying to do here is just get the point across of like, this is a very possible future, and it's a little scary. But on the other side of the axis of accelerationism, when we start thinking about post-Fordism, and, you know, talking about this wave of blanding, that's where Humanist Blandcore comes in. And so, you know, the Ford and post-Fordism, you know, that comes from the American auto manufacturer Henry Ford. You know, he was one of the early proponents. I know that there was more of the sort of the assembly line and the mass production, but post-Fordism moves away from this mass production mentality for large groups, in order to focus on specialized production for smaller groups. And so what that means is that we start moving away from the economies of scale, and this bland core, this blanding, you know, really is all about economies of scope. And so this scope aesthetic, you know, when it's not sometimes at all the products are the same, but it's like this Humanist Blandcore aesthetic is built for the lowest common denomination required to obtain capital. So that it's going to be the most vanilla, the most approachable, the most pleasing, the most easy, and sort of the lowest effort required in order to obtain capital, and reach the most people without, you know, causing offense. So this banal mystique of sameness and non-offensive consumerism is celebrated in this aesthetic construct. And, you know, so if we look and examine this axis here, you know, between late stage capitalism and sort of this new alt-woke protopianism, and I'll dive into that in just a minute, it's really important to know that, like, and I'm going to harp on some of these mattress companies as well, because especially in the US, it just seems like in 2017, you know, maybe 2018, or perhaps a year earlier, there was just this wave, and it just sort of hit all at once because there was a, you know, there was a big profit to be made, even if all these different, you know, companies didn't have the desire to help people sleep better. It was just about how can we produce something for cheap and sort of bandwagon onto this. So it's not that all products are the same, it's that all the marketing is the same in this Blandcore movement. And, you know, a quote here, which I immediately was attracted to, if you have a Google AdWords account and you know a subcontractor, you can sell a mattress online. That's it. And so this is just starting to really emphasize and go into the fact that some of these Me Too mattress companies, or the, you know, shippable mattresses, you know, sometimes it might not always be, not sometimes, it's usually not always best for the planet, depending on the materiality that they're putting in there. But just the fact that it became a popular way for startups to make cash just because they're realizing the huge profit margin, that's some of the darker signal in the noise. And a quote from Rachel Hawley of the Corporate Logo Singularity article: specificity is ill-suited to the dream of amoeba-like growth. And that just kind of goes back to what I was mentioning earlier, is like when everything's the same and everything's easy and approachable and happy, and we'll look at some examples too, it just sort of, it's very easy to market and spread. There's no challenge. So if we go back to a spectrum, you know, you remember the KFC, sort of the unchecked potential of like, well, what actually happens if KFC becomes eternal? You know, what if we really do run into some sort of weird, bizarre, like Taco Bell universe? You know, when we start to look across the spectrum and look at some of the areas and the signals in the middle, and then some of these examples that I have on the other side of like woke, that's where this spectrum starts to show its path out, or at least allude to its own exhaustion. So, right in the middle, we kind of have this like happy medium between like, hey, it's not full on just unchecked growth. There is some sort of like curation. There is a prescribed style that's easily copy and pastable. Again, so I'm just going to harp on some of these mattress companies, but a lot of them have sort of the same vibe. And there's a lot of articles, out there that you can find, and I'll share a few that are really interesting, that really dive into like the blanding wave, or sort of this notion of like premium mediocre. Yeah, like some of those names like Humanist Blandcore, those are easy to come by, and it's really important sort of to wrap your head around the fact that a lot of it, if you don't understand why it exists or why they all look the same, the answer is typically money. But on this other end, like the alt woke, I'm like low key fascinated with what Gwyneth Paltrow has been able to do with Goop. Because I think, it's a bit of a signal with what she's doing. So definitely, I think the approach and some of the products lean into Humanist Blandcore, but some of the behavior. So if you think about like a duck above water and like dog paddling below, there's sort of this interesting split between, I think, what Goop is going for. And so that, for me, takes it a little bit closer to this alt woke world, where she's beginning to, and she's talking to the right people. So I'm just specifically going to call out, the Goop episode. I think it was on Netflix, where she spoke with people from MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. She's starting to bring in this new awareness to the next way that we can expand and think and connect with the inner world and the outer world. So for that, I'm very fascinated to see where Goop goes. But she's definitely trending away from the Blandcore and into the alt woke. So I'm going to keep an eye on Goop for sure. And then if you're curious, like, why is there a photo of a guy holding a bunch of bread? There is a criminally underrated film from 2007 called Michael Clayton. But more importantly is that there's a character in that film named Arthur Edens. And so that's where I'm going to stop. I'm just going to totally like make it vague and mysterious to make you guys go watch this, because if I'm trying to give you an example of like, well, what is like an alt woke prerogative? Arthur Edens in this film, anyway, just go watch it. And then just for fun, like I saw this alt woke party logo and I thought, yeah, that kind of checks out. Plus it's just easy to laugh at. So yeah, we'll dive into a little bit more alt woke stuff in Turbo. But what you can see, like, and I definitely want to get some more examples out there of like, well, what exactly am I talking about? At least aesthetically, the socioeconomic angle is like, let's just make money, and how do we make money easiest and reach the most people? And so that's sort of where this aesthetic language comes in, where everything looks the same. So, excuse me, if you see these 4 examples, all 4 different companies, but clearly either they're talking to the same brand or strategy consulting group. The source of the style is far-reaching. And these are, yeah, just more examples. Like everything's just very like pastel, millennial, easy, soothing, calm. Everyone's smiling. Everything's like slightly sexual, but kind of not really. I mean, this is very like, I think if you're like me, studying and looking at the world around you, at least online, or, depending on what city or geographic zone you're living in, none of this should be very much of a shock or anything that's not familiar to you at this point. Sans serif pastels, just easy, breezy, beautiful, But so taking all of that into account, if we think about, the axis of accelerationism, where companies can like really, really get wild and start to exploit, or you think about Humanist Blandcore, where it's a little bit more of like a curated economies of scope money grab. that's where we're going to start to really examine some of those topics and look at this second engagement tool, which is exploration over exploitation. So some of you might be familiar with this, this tool or this triangle, but there's a way that we can take the intent here and then move it to be a little bit more appropriate for a future direction. So if we look at typically how things are exploited or the engine behind it, and I'm taking sometimes a little bit of the worst case scenario here. Desirability, what are people willing to pay for? Viability, how much potential for profit exists? And then when you match those two with feasibility, how possible is it? That's why some of these mattress companies, and there's other products, there's other services. I'm just trying to keep it, as simple as possible with one example for each section. But mattresses were super easy, and there's a lot of potential for profit, and people, it turns out, are willing to pay enough to obtain the profit for that, especially with the convenience of having it sent via FedEx immediately, or UPS, DHL, whatever, to your home. So what happens if we keep feasibility? When we start to get into the engine for exploration, how possible is it? That's really important. But what if we change out desirability and we start to talk about provocation? How much can it influence the future? And if you're like me, you want to leave a positive impact, or at least assist with a positive change. So that's provocation comes in handy. And then aesthetics. I mean, I'm a designer, so this is definitely like in my mental sort of wheelhouse and visual focus almost daily. So when we combine how possible is something, how much can it influence the future, and also what are you arrested by? For me, that's a really strong exit out of a Humanist Blandcore type scenario. And so let's take a look at an example. So here, I don't get me wrong, I appreciate and value the idea of electric mobility. But if I didn't tell you that the Rivian R1T was an electric truck, the original vibe and the shape, the industrial design, it alludes to potentially a fossil fuel powered truck that you might see today or next year. I would say beyond the headlights, that's kind of the only signal that I'm really getting, maybe the grille as well, of something that's, alluding to the past, or is just taking a common pattern and not really pushing it. It's 90% of the intent is great, but how can it provoke? How can it arrest you? What's the next step? And so this is a super easy, example to grab or to latch onto. But for me, that's where the aesthetics really come into play. Like how is this arresting product? It also, it's not lost on me that Tesla's, definitely going to make a profit. So is Rivian. But if these, if you think about if these were the same price point, and you had the same sort of positive effect on the world by choosing to drive one of these, or utilize one of these instead of a gas-powered vehicle, or maybe you don't buy any of them and you just use public transportation or ride a bike, all of that's fine. But for the purpose of this example, I would be willing to bet that the aesthetic bravery of the Cybertruck is probably going to be more widely accepted, because it's alluding to an exit, something that's not bland. It's, this is the next thing. And so I think for some of those reasons, and we'll dive into some of the tenets of Turbo Mañana a bit later, but for me, that's a path. So here we are, we're at checkpoint number 2, and I'm looking at time. We're still doing okay on time. So we're definitely gonna take the full 7 minutes here, but just to sort of set the stage for you here, definitely keep in mind this exploration over exploitation. This is your main focus and drive. So what I want you to do is, first of all, if you haven't finished it yet, or if you've been doing it while I've been speaking forever, Finish your 2x2, look at your tired versus wired, and make sure that you have a really, or that you feel good about expanding and working on your wired and experimental quadrant. And so when you do that, like the evolution of that is the engine for exploration. So I want you to run yourself through these questions of, is it feasible? How does it influence the future? And does it arrest you? So feasibility, how possible is it? Can this be done near future? You know, you might remember the Adidas Futurecraft loop. They're still working on it. Even their website says like, hey, we're still testing. Some of the shoes are still in beta, like they're being very transparent, but they're still like sort of setting a date of like, it will happen, but we just want to make sure it's a true one-to-one. Provocation, how does it influence the future or challenge current norms? So how is this passion area subject topic going to, how's it going to provoke? How's it going to take you outside of this, like, well, can we just make money off of it? And, you know, is it super, super desirable? Like, how can it produce probably a new, healthier behavior? And then aesthetics, like, you know, does it arrest you? Like, I mean, I think there's a lot of value in finding something, or at least, you know, searching for something that has the intent to captivate, inspire, make you say, wow. So with all of that said, find me on Discord, look for me on the chat here. Happy to answer any questions, but I'm going to play another 7-minute track just to keep us on time. So I'm going to stop talking. Think about this and listen to this music. Okay, friends. So that signals the end of the track. But again, you don't need to worry if this isn't finished. It's just a really good sort of like checkpoint for you to consider your wired and experimental quadrant and how that can evolve and sort of exit some of these paths like Neo-Feudalism and Humanist Blandcore. So there will be time at the end, especially in the future cast and the share out, for questions. And, you know, I'll definitely make sure to, that at the end, whenever we're doing share outs, I'll minimize the screen share and it can just be much more of like a conversation at that point, just so I'm not staring at the presentation the whole time. I appreciate the engagement and sort of the pace that we're going at. So thank you. Okay, so as we move along, you know, and new surprises, we're at the Turbo Mañana section, and in here we're definitely going to have the bulk of the workshop. So this is where you're actually going to write a FutureCast pitch based on the wired and experimental quadrant, and then also the engine for migration. So we'll have a bit of a share out as well. And then after the share out, there's a very brief exit ceremony. So I'll be excited to watch with all of you as we continue. And then just a quick reminder on the terraform. So if we think back just a little bit to the beginning of the presentation, I was lost in this sort of like nootropic aesthetic audit exercise. And then that led me to some deeper questions around, where does this fit sort of in the aesthetic world of things? And then, so then that led to this sort of terraform evolution outside of 2x2. And, for me, this movement or this proposal really is less of like a destination, but just more of a direction, So the thing that I will probably speak a lot about in this final, like, sort of axis exploration is the axis of metamodernism. And I think how important that is for me personally, but also for us to consider whenever we're working with clients, or if you're in school, thinking about ways to apply this to work or wherever you might be, professionally or in an educational, or just being a human. That's I think metamodernism for all is a refreshing topic, especially in times like these. So on the terraform, we've talked about the world of yesterday. We've reviewed the world's fastest Black Mirror episode in Neo-Feudalism. And we've talked about some of the forces at play that sort of lead to this very common blanding wave in the Humanist Blandcore. And so we'll discuss the alt-woke protopianism as it pertains on the axis to acid communism, and sort of opens up the door for this future destination, direction of Turbo Mañana. So there is two things here that I want to highlight. There's actually a speaker at Reclaim Futures who will be speaking on Sunday. Her name's Emma. She wrote an article about acid communism, I would say maybe a year ago. And the quote from that is probably the perfect way to sort of like not only to intro the Turbo Mañana section, but also to sort of bring us full circle from the original quote at the beginning about capitalist realism, how it's really difficult for people to imagine anything beyond sort of the capitalist world that we find ourselves in. And so, definitely I will make sure to share the link to this article, because unfortunately the article has, the publisher, the magazine, has since shuttered its service. But anyway, besides the point, if the future we want lies at the limits of our imagination, we must begin there with the creative, unruly parts of our consciousness, the parts that capital wants to claim as its own. And so some of these tenets, that are found within some of the original thinkings that not only came from Mark Fisher, but Jeremy Gilbert and others around, what is it going to take for us to get beyond the capitalist realist mindset? And it really is going to take some things that I'm actually about to outline. And so I'm happy and super stoked to share those with you. So anyway, full circle moment. And then, if you took anything away from like the whole axis of metamodernism, it's that, or if you just wanted a quick one-liner, is that in its core, it's a bit of a romantic reaction to our crisis-ridden moment. So it finds things that are opposing and just allows itself to be both. And so there's this idea of oscillation, constantly moving back and forth between perhaps and sometimes complementary or even opposing forces. So it's being very flexible. It's approaching life, work, everything with this very flexible both and mindset. So for me, this is going to get like super poetic, very psychedelic all of a sudden, and then I'm going to rein it back and give you something that's a little bit more practical or easier to consume. But for me, Turbo Mañana is like an aqueous and light-saturated futurist position grounded in a both-and oscillation framework, gaining new meaning from nostalgic reference in an infinite loop of reinterpretation. And yeah, I think I'm just gonna like leave that as poetry that's very like open to interpretation. Happy to chat about this more during the future cast. The Too Long Didn't Read, Turbo Mañana is the perpetual Ouroboros of hyperreality. And so if we look at, you know, again, like if you remember from the Humanist Blandcore section, this sort of this alt woke, this next thing, it's trying to find ways to not really lean into some of the other reactions to capitalism, like neoliberalism, for example. So some of the examples that I want to talk about or bring up here, at least for one, really just for your awareness, you know, and I know that the format for this online isn't super easy during a live stream to have like a discussion about it. However, at least I just want to leave you with some things to think about today and beyond. So if we start looking at ways that, you know, services or organizations are moving away from, you know, the world of yesterday or the systems of present, there's some things that I want to call out, especially like, you know, from a school or a service model. There's a new experiment happening right now called Dark Study, and they're definitely trying to move away from the traditional grad school, at least in the United States, sort of profit model and mentality. Application process is very different. And from what I've gathered, it's definitely worth you taking a quick peek. And then another like really cool signal in the noise for me, especially in the alt woke side, not related to a certain like nonprofit at this point, but it is a signal for me, is field trip health beginning to elevate and sort of add some scientific rigor and also some much needed awareness, at least to the public. So field trip health is starting to look into, you know, ways to sort of mainstream psychedelic substances in a way to aid and assist with mental health and finding ways, therapeutic opportunities for things like psilocybin and beyond. So sort of this alt woke protopia, it's not exactly like totally utopia, but I think that's kind of the point with this, on this edge of the spectrum, is like it's finding a closer path to an ideal state without having to make it perfect. Naturally, like I think some of the thinking and practice from Buckminster Fuller, definitely worth your time taking a deep dive into some of his work, some of his thoughts as well. And then on the other end, so I mentioned that article, which I think is a really solid intro to Acid Communism by Emma, who's also speaking on Sunday. Check that out. Definitely highlighting some of the original intent from Mark Fisher. But then, you know, here's another film reference. I don't know if you've seen Uncut Gems, but there's definitely sort of a turbo mentality that's associated with the Black Opal. So I'm not going to, you know, no spoilers here, but keep a close eye on the journey of the Black Opal in that film. I think it's, for me, it's a bit of a hidden character, and the energy behind it and the energy transfer really speaks to some of the tenets that I'll be sharing about Turbo Mañana, and getting to the root of really this directional intent that I'm excited and, you know, currently exploring, working on with myself and others. But anyway, so the Black Opal there, and then you know, in the middle here, sort of firmly between alt woke, protopianism, acid communism. You know, I like the intent behind lots. Again, I'll send these links out. I think this is all worth a deeper dive for all of you later. And maybe I realize, you know, some of the workshop, it might be wandering into some philosophical territory, and I'm happy to chat and to find you all on Discord and on other channels as we keep going. But for the purpose of time, I'm going to walk us through to the core of the issue here. So there's 6 tenets that I really want to get across, and they're all based in the meta-modern values. So the first one is really just examining and exploring metaphysics at large. So at its core, Turbo Mañana seeks to elevate inner worlds, and it does that by examining or utilizing the oscillation, the both and moment between the metaphysical and the empirical. So what's something that's intangible and abstract that maybe we can feel or allude to versus the scientific fact, the rigor, it's been explored and tested and it's explainable. So approaching items, topics, and services under that guise is definitely the first tenet. And so if that one, if metaphysics is really seeking to elevate and explore and expand the inner world, then tenet 2, hyperreality, this is where it begins to coalesce and sort of mesh with this outer world. So Turbo Mañana seeks hyperreality and flexible consciousness paradigms. And so the oscillation balance that I'm suggesting and offering up here is this spectrum, or this back and forth between perhaps psychedelic hyperreality or augmented hyperreality. So there's some current thinking I'm doing around AR and what the future of that could mean in a Turbo Mañana world or lifestyle. So metaphysics, tenet 1, hyperreality, tenet 2. Very interconnected. How does the inner world meet the outer world, and how does that flex and expand, and how can we push it there? How can I push it there? Tenet 3, Turbo Mañana invokes a new epoch of infinite radiance. So one of the things is, this is a stronger carryover from the original audit. It was one of those things that I couldn't quite discern or wrap my head around. It was like, why are some of these products that I'm seeing, or some of these ideas that are trying to be, discussed or expanded upon with nootropics, why is everything so bright and shiny? Don't know if I have the answer yet, but I definitely like the intent. So the exploration here around radiance is, the oscillation, the meta-modern framework here for this tenet is between absence and abundance. So aesthetically, this has a lot of avenues, and then philosophically, that's still very much a work in progress for me on radiance. And then tenet 4 is all about exchange. And if you recall back to the Adidas Futurecraft loop example, that's a really good example of some of the positive symbiosis that can happen, and it's definitely like even slated for the future. That's why it's such a good example for us to consider and talk about, is that it's addressing the needs of the consumer, the company, and the earth all at the same time. And so that oscillation that we can notice there being explored, like maybe that example specifically hits on pure symbiosis, and then some of the things that we've explored or looked at, or at least that we're aware of now, especially in the Neo-Feudalism chapter of this journey, things where it gets a little bit more exploitative, darker territory for sure. So that's tenet 4. Turbo Mañana is all about exchange and celebrating uncharted forms of symbiosis and energy transference. And I'm totally aware, like, some of this stuff might seem like very lofty, philosophical, but for me, it goes back to the whole mythopoetry thing. Like, when you invent new worlds, like, it's not always going to feel comfortable. So, I mean, I admire all of your bravery for sticking out and hanging out up to this point, and we'll explore all of this in your future casts and see how we can get there. But tenet 5, synesthesia. Turbo Mañana explores the frontier of hybrid sensory enhancement. The motivations here are definitely like leaning into some of the tenets of consciousness as well, and then borrowing from tenet 2 of hyperreality. So the oscillation framework here, Turbo Mañana seeks to operate, expand, and explore the areas between intangible and tangible. So this can come up in sort of experiential design, physical products, and then on the intangible side, yeah, nootropics, compounds, psychedelics, exploring everything. And then the final one, tenet 6, is all about space-time. Turbo Mañana honors all dimensions of the space-time continuum. I promise this is not a cult. It's just a, yeah, it's my poetic response to the world around me. And so the oscillation framework is really balancing out, you know, when we think about nonlinear space-time, and then the reason that you're looking at a shoe or sort of this like sandal, you know, this is trying to capture or at least allude to all the 4 dimensions that we typically deal with, and then the long, you know, space, time, depth, all of those. And then nonlinear is all the hidden dimensions that have been alluded to by scientists, but sometimes might not always be perceptual to all of us. So yeah, tenet 6, very bizarre, very out there. But anyway, I'm happy to explore it. And so when all of those tenets, you know, thinking those are be the sort of the framework or the jumping off point of like, how does something allude to or reach into and tap into Turbo Mañana? So for me, these are sort of the 6 things that not all of them have to hit. If I can make at least one, or sort of whenever I'm ideating on a new business model or consulting with clients, it's like sort of their motivation or drive is to hit at least 1 or 2 of the tenets at any given time, just because for me, it's signaling an exit from the world of yesterday. It's definitely not going to be Humanist Blandcore, and a lot of the socio-economic, probably the hidden, less aesthetic, a little bit more like practice and strategy is going to be anti-neo-feudal. So with all of that said, we're definitely like approaching, let's see, top of the hour-ish, depending. This is going to lead us into the last checkpoint before we do a future cash share out. So there's a couple of things that I'm going to happen here, and we can probably, if you want, you know, we can take maybe a little bit more than 7 minutes, and it'll take me a little bit just to help set this up for you and set the stage for the example. But you know, so you've been working on the wired and experimental quadrant, and you've also looked at the engine for exploration. And so now the combination of these 2 things, you're definitely going to write your future cast pitch. And what I'm going to do is add all of the resources from this, from the beginning of the workshop onto Arena, and that's linked in Discord, and I'll make sure that it's linked in the chat as well. But what that's going to do is allow you to set up, like if you follow this fill in the blank or like a little bit of an ad lib exercise, and I'm going to show you an example in just a moment. But what this does is that it's going to allow you to set up the pitch. And so that's where, you know, this becomes a little less about sort of absorbing and trying to understand this directional intent and philosophy, and it's a little bit more about practice and application, and we'll talk about it and do some share outs and see how that goes. So if you are looking at 1, 2, 3, and 4, so 1 is just your FutureCast intro. So your wired and experimental quadrant is, and then you label what it is, evolves, and then you've got a transition moment, and then you've got your FutureCast outro. You sort of say how it's different because of the provocation and aesthetics, and then bonus, if there's a way that it can tie into one of the tenets of Turbo Mañana, that's cool to highlight. So I'm going to take us through an example. This brings us, again, back to the very first checkpoint. So if we look at fast fashion and how to evolve and move out of the world of yesterday, find a signal in the noise, but maybe something that isn't quite there yet, and then you look at a moment where, you know, a new sun rises, or there's just something that's that allows you to evolve it and push it past the 90% to 100%, like a future-proof idea. You can start to look at this pitch. So again, nothing to do with Adidas. I just like the example. The Adidas Futurecraft Loop is a fully recyclable shoe that evolves the fast fashion model because unfair labor practices and non-sustainable materiality sourcing and toxic disposal are harming humans and the planet we live on. By focusing on frontiers and abandoning the world of yesterday, that's your intros, that second part, the Futurecraft Loop is made to be remade through recyclable plastic components and sets the tone for consumers to consider recycling a pair of shoes when they're old. By design, the Futurecraft Loop looks like what an astronaut might wear while on a lab in Mars. And then the Turbo Mañana bonus, the tenet that I think works the best here, the Futurecraft Loop aligns to the exchange tenet of Turbo, because it's really highlighting that symbiosis. It's looking at the both and oscillation between moving away from an exploitative exchange and into something that's much more symbiotic for all the partners involved. So everyone's getting a little bit of a healthier outcome, new behaviors for the consumer, profit income for the company, but also a break, even if it's a small amount, it's still something on the planet and materiality sourcing. So all of these examples are moments away from being unlocked on Arena, and I will reshare that link just so that you can search and look through all the tenets on your own time. So what I'm going to do is stop talking, and I will share that, the resources, and send a link. And then, yeah, so let's listen to this track, and then if we need more time, we can totally do it. And feel free to turn down the music if that's not to your liking. So I'm going to go unlock that, and then I'll hit the chat in just a moment. Yeah, guys, that is awesome. I'm seeing that you're taking full advantage of the Arena channel. So there's some unlocked blocks in there, and you can start to access the examples and all of the tenets as well. So I've got all of the meta-modern oscillation paradigms in there for you to check out, and then some of the examples from before. So, oops. Music stops, don't worry. But yeah, so there's the tired and experimental quadrant exercise that's in there, and then we've got the engine for exploration. It's now live in the channel as well. So any sort of visual reference material that you might need, that's up there. And I'm going to leave this on for a few more minutes, and then I'm actually going to switch to video. Excuse me, to just looking at from my cam, and then we can start chatting about these, or just bring up any questions or thoughts and see how we can apply that to your Futurecast pitch. So a few more minutes, and I will jump back on.
Can you go back a slide? Andrew, can you go back a slide?
Hey, if someone is, hold on, I might have an audio issue, one sec. Hey, are you still able to hear me?
Now I can.
All right,
Yeah,
cool.
earlier I can.
Yeah, if you guys need specific slides, let me know. Okay, cool. So what I'm going to do for a moment is actually, I'm going to get away from full screen just so I can see the chat in the main window a little bit more. One sec. All right, so how's everyone doing? Is this like too intense, or do you need more time? Hey, how's everyone feeling? Do we have any volunteers to share out a future cast, or maybe even just like one of the checkpoints? Like, was there anything about the wired or experimental quadrant that was exciting, or the exploration engine? And it's totally cool if you want to work on the future cast longer and then just share that privately later. I realize like over a live stream it could probably be a lot, so I totally respect the decision. But let me know how you're feeling.
I'm happy to share if no one else is.
Yeah, Cesar? Hey, yeah, thanks. I would love to hear it.
Yeah.
What's going on? What's your passion area? Okay.
I'm doing housing. Cool. Should I like run through like, so like my third
Yeah.
established is just like regular landlord renter housing. So my product, what would you call it? Yeah, I guess a product
Yeah.
would be nomadic earth shelter kits. So rather than housing, you just build your own shelters for nomad lifestyle out of earth materials. So nomadic earth shelter kits is an ephemeral and biodegradable form of housing that involves landlord-renter relationships that are exploitative and non-sustainable in the midst of a climate crisis. By focusing on new frontiers and abandoning the world of yesterday, nomadic earth shelter kits shift the paradigm of housing by removing the issue brought upon by ownership. By using found elements of the earth to create sustainable community housing for the modern nomad, by design, these kits allow people to build ant-like colonies that degrade over time. Nomadic earth shelter kits align with the exchange tenet of the Turbo Mañana through the symbiosis of earth, inhabitant, and community.
Dude, I love it. Did you make any sketches or like what the industrial design of the shelter might look like?
My vision was, again, kind of like an ant colony, right? So just like maybe like a pyramid-looking thing that goes underground and is all built out of earth and found materials.
Nice. And would you see these being like, you know, something that people could build on for like having a multi-family environment, or like other people could join and add on to another sort of ephemeral hut, if you will?
Yeah. So like what I was thinking is like it would more so be a shift away from housing as we know, where you just live in one place at a time and people are just like constantly shifting around. So like I might find a nomad community somewhere that already has their earth shelter, and I just go in and like build my own part that connects to the rest of it. So it's constantly degrading and building upon as people move in and out and as climate changes.
Dude, sign me up. I'll come over to your pod and we can talk about Turbo Mañana and hang out. Sounds great.
Yeah, there you go.
Hey, thank you for sharing, Sisa.
For sure.
All right, Clark, Julio, what's going on? Any yours, or do you guys want to go do private arena stuff later? There's no wrong answer.
Yeah, I sort of fell off the train at like mid point in the thing, so I just sort of like I've been more of an observer for the last half of the workshop, but I really enjoyed it. And yeah, I mean, I can the when we were doing the like tired wired established experimental quadrant thing, like I think for one, I picked passion area, and there's like the second part was like, what is something that you've seen an evolution in the passion area? And I think like streaming is a pretty big evolution in music, which was kind of the passion area I focused on. And then like, I think a signal in the noise is like Bandcamp Fridays, like the way that Bandcamp has basically like fostered a music community through like not taking profits on Fridays has been really interesting. And so then like starting to think about like what a wired idea could, would be like some kind of like cooperatively owned streaming platform where like artists basically get all the profits all the time. I mean, I don't really know how that works in terms of like who's running the platform and who's designing it and building it and shit. But like, I think some around, like how can streaming really benefit artists? For like right now, I feel like it's been pretty bad for musicians for the most part.
I've got to say, dude, that's a really strong signal in the noise. I think you should probably chat with Benjamin. I think he's definitely in that space as well, like one of the founders of the Reclaim Futures. So find him, chat about some of these signals. Anyway, I see a connection brewing, so find him on Discord, if you will. But dude, sounds dope. If you find yourself like getting towards the Futurecast pitch at any point, feel free to share on Arena, or you and I can connect later. But thanks, dude.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. All right, Clark. Anything you want to share out? It's just a seed of an idea.
Sure. Can you guys hear me? Okay. So when you were talking about, can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, when you guys were talking about like the fast fashion industry, I was considering how that is applicable in like the outdoor gear market, where we've seen like this rapid consolidation of like outdoor gear and outdoor like athletes. It's really sorry. So anyways, I said that my experiment utilizes the 6 tenets of Turbo Mañana and moves away from the neo-feudalist leanings of the outdoor gear and clothing industry, where the current framework, or the framework of yesterday, as we say, is separates the consumer, the user, and the outdoor steward. And my alternative kind of Futurecast pitch, which isn't quite ready yet, would blend the user and the consumer and the outdoor steward together. It builds organizations rather than stores, and fosters a community of gear sharing, along with conservation-minded responsibility towards outdoor recreation, rather than kind of the capitalist weekend warrior type of perspective that big stores like REI or C.R.E.A.M Trading Post or backcountry.com kind of foster. I'd say signal in the noise would be a brand called Cotopaxi, which does a good job of really putting their money where their mouth is when it comes to outdoor sustainability, along with, to a lesser extent, Patagonia, and the way that they foster outdoor, or in the way that they like donate back to national parks and stuff like that. But I'd say in my wired experimental situation, each individual user would be part of a network, and they would have a specific responsibility to maybe potentially a campground or a trail section, and they would be tied to working together via the network of outdoor responsibilities. And it would reprioritize outdoor conservation and then recreation, and then and then there's kind of like capitalist consumerism, where today's outdoor industry prioritizes consumerism, then outdoor recreation, and lastly conservation. I'd say an example of like whatever the like broke quadrant of the triangle would be is the REI garage sale, where they'll sell used gear, usually stuff from their return bin and stuff, and then take the money at a marketed price and resell it to consumers, which is like a very, I guess, on the base versus cringe scale, a cringe way of trying to appear as if you're creating a model of economic sustainability, when in fact they're constantly feeding into the same model of fast fashion and whatnot. I guess the tenet I was focused on is the one of like, what is it, recognizing the past, the one with the Croc Birkenstock.
Space time.
That's right. Just like taking old frameworks of outdoor stewardship and blending them in with the consumer product relationship.
That's solid, man. I heard a lot of sort of business model reshaping in there and conservational intent moving to the top. Sounds good, man. And I appreciate the communal values of kind of all three that I heard. So yeah, dude, that's fascinating. Did anyone have any questions, or did you want to like sort of end on some sort of like psychedelic poetic moment and then we can just call it a day? Because I know that this has been a lot, but there's like a 1 minute exit ceremony, and then I can, you know, give you a thumbs up and say thank you, and then we can move on. All right. So I'm going to switch back to full screen here, and then I'll wave goodbye now. And then I'll see you on the shores of tomorrow somewhere. So let's see. All right. The sunset of this Western epoch is at our backs. Can you feel it? We can disrobe our post-scarcity shrouds and adornments. We can leave the plateau of establishment, passing the orchards of low-hanging fruit, transcending the mountains of apathy and valleys of despair. We can take solace knowing that we've reached the shores of tomorrow. A new sun rises. The waves of hyperreality reflect a vivid and enveloping light. We've become one with it, post-organic, pre-techno, and altogether meta. This is Turbo Mañana. I want to thank you guys for hanging out, and to everyone on the stream who's been watching along. This has been fun, and you know, find me, like I'm around, and I'm gonna be hanging out during the rest of Reclaim Futures over the weekend. Yeah, let's keep the conversation going, and thank you so much for spending your time with me today. Peace.
Thanks, Andrew.
Hey, thanks everyone.